Hi viewers, welcome back to MasterJSkills. In today's video, we will see what are Spring Boot starters, where exactly it is used, how it is helping in the development, and why exactly they have introduced in this Spring Boot. We will see everything about the Spring Boot starters in this video. Please make sure to watch the video till the end so that you will not miss out any topic for more clear understanding. Please subscribe to MasterJSkills if you like any content from the MasterJSkills, or if you like any tutorial, please like that video so that it will make me to shoot more of the content on Java and J2EE. So without making much delay, let's jump into the Spring Boot starters. So before starters, I just wanted to speak on a jar. In monolithic application, where we used to add the jar files in the build path. So what is this particular jar? Jar is nothing but an application which has some sort of a functionality that we will be using in our application. So it's called as a dependency. So our application is dependent on some other application functionality. That particular jar file or a jar library is called as a dependency. So dependent on some other application functionality is called the dependencies. Spring Boot starters are the bundle of dependencies, like a bundle of dependencies in the sense it has encapsulated a related bundle of jars into a single jar. So it's called the Spring Boot starters. So the Spring Boot starters are a dependency descriptors which contains a bundle of related dependencies. Spring Boot built-in starters make a development easier and rapid. So it makes development much easier and rapid, because before we used to have spend our time in managing the dependencies and its version, downloading from somewhere else and adding into our build path, into our application. Lots of issues with the versions. So that and all is resolved from the built-in starters. So when it has these all the tasks it has eliminated, then obviously it will make our development very rapid. So in the Spring Boot framework, all the starters follow a similar naming patterns, that is Spring Boot starter star. So star is nothing but which denotes a particular type of application or dependency. So let's have a case where Spring Boot already have a built-in starters, but if you want to import something from some other functionality, take an example of your own jar file, your own dependency or third-party dependencies. In that case, you are not supposed to use Spring Boot starters because it's specifically for official Spring Boot artifacts only. You have to add your own naming convention for your dependency. So we can even add a third-party dependencies, but the starters name is only for a Spring Boot official artifacts. So all these starter dependency where it will be added in our project, so in the pom.xml file. So let's have a look on pom.xml in IDE. So I have an application called EMS that you know that EMS I am exploring with this tutorial. So I have included most of the starters in this file. Actually, it will be included in the pom.xml. So it has only this pom.xml has only related dependencies for EMS application. So I don't want to disturb this pom.xml for this tutorial. So I have included most of the dependencies, starter dependencies in this pom.xml. So you can see, so the Spring Boot starter theme leaf. So this particular dependency starter is used to build a MVC web application using theme leaf view. So this is particularly used for view purpose, in the sense UI purpose. So when we are developing a web MVC, so in that case, if we want particular UI related dependencies, in that case we will go for theme leaf. So the next dependency is Spring Boot starter web service. So this dependency is used for Spring web services. Okay. So the next is Spring Boot starter mail. This is completely related to Java mail support. And next is Spring Boot Starter Data Redis. This is for Redis support. Redis related starter dependencies with Spring Boot data Redis. So next starter is Spring Boot Starter Web. So this is particularly again for a Spring MVC, but it is used to it uses a Tomcat as a default embedded container. Even we can change this embedded Tomcat as well. So next is Spring Boot Starter Test. So this is particularly for to use to test the Spring Boot application with libraries like JUnit, Mockito and all. So next is Spring Boot Starter Security. It's for Spring Boot Security dependency. So next is Spring Boot Starter JPA. So this is for JPA with Hibernate. Next is Spring Boot Starter. So this is a core starter. So we have to include this one. It has a production ready features and auto configuration support. Most of the features it has added into the Spring Boot Starter. It has included many of the dependencies. Okay, next is Spring Boot Starter Data MongoDB. So this is for MongoDB database and Spring Data MongoDB. So the next is Spring Boot Starter Data REST. So when we want particularly REST data REST web service, then we can go for REST. And Spring Boot Actuators. This is a production ready features where we can monitor and manage our application. So the next dependency is Spring Boot Starter Undertow. This is a embedded server. If we want particularly, default is Tomcat. If we want particularly, we can have that particular dependencies. But next is Spring Boot Starter Jetty. So again, this is a embedded server. Next is Spring Boot Starter Logging. So for logging purpose, we will be using this starter. And the next is Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. It's an embedded server container. The next is Spring Boot Starter Log4j. So these are the starters. So let's go on top. So you can see here the parent tag. So inside parent we have a Spring Boot Starter parent. So what is the use of this particular element or this particular parent starter? So when we have a parent starter, what are the advantages we will see? Okay, so the Spring Boot starter parent is a project starter. It provides a default configuration for our application. So it provides the default configuration for our application. It is used internally by all the dependencies. All Spring Boot projects use a Spring Boot starter parent as a parent in the pom.xml file. So as we have saw here, it uses parent tag where it uses a default configuration. So let's see what are the default configurations. So it provides these all the configuration to the child projects. So for example, configurations, it maintains some configurations like Java version, source encoding and resource filtering, and also and it also controls the default plugin configurations. Like these are the properties. You can include any properties. So this is provided by the parent POM. So it is using a particular version. So when we define here version, so version conflicts also getting resolved because we are specifying the default version for all the dependencies will be 2.2.5 release. All the dependencies will be fetched from this release itself. So here no need to give a version. So I think I have given somewhere. I can show you. Yeah, here. So here if we want particular version override the default configuration, then we can include this version, or else if I remove this element, then it will be fetching this particular version. So this is an advantage. Having this conflict, we can mention the version in the parent starter itself. So this is one of the advantage. And and here the plugins. So even it includes the plugin configuration as well. So this plugin and properties are dependent on the property configurations, gives a default configuration to the all the dependencies. So some application will not have this parent starter, so in that case there is some modification. So what is that? So in some cases every dependencies, okay, let's have a case where some projects uses a different versions, like it includes the theme leaf as in 3 version, whereas it may include web service features of a 2 version, and they need a different version for all the dependencies. Then in that case this will not come into the picture. In that case what we will be doing is we'll be doing a manual dependency management. In that case we have to include this dependency management. So inside dependency management we will be using dependencies. In that we will be using particular dependency. You can see here we have to mention the version, type of that particular jar or a dependency, and what is the scope. Everything we have to mention here in case we remove the parent starter. Indeed, in some cases we need not to inherit Spring Boot starter parent in the pom.xml file. To handle such cases, Spring Boot provides the flexibility to still use the dependency management without inheriting the Spring Boot starter parent. This is why we will be including parent starter, and without parent starter we have to include dependency management tag and include all the dependent configuration for every individual dependencies we include in our project. So this is the use of Spring Boot parent starter. Let's take one starter example, how it will be bundled, like what kind of related dependency it will include. So I will take an example of Spring Boot starter web. So the Spring Boot starter web is transitively dependent on the following. So it is dependent on Spring Boot starter, which is an basic starter, and the Spring Boot starter Tomcat, as it is a web. It needs a embedded server, and web inside that starter validation from request and response. So data should bind. Jackson data bind it is using, and it is using Spring Web, it is using Spring MVC. So these all are bundled inside the Spring Boot web. So this is a beauty of a Spring Boot starter web. So it has basically included Tomcat, starter validation, Jackson data bind, Spring Web, and Spring MVC. So instead of including these all, we can include only one. This is a kind of an advantage. If we see what is the disadvantage of it is, we don't want a particular implementation. See, don't want a Spring Web MVC. So in that case, simply we will be making heavier for our application. In that case, if we don't want particular jar, or if it is a conflict in the development, in that case we can exclude that particular dependency. We can exclude that dependencies like by exclusion. So in that we can exclude particular starter. So here it is excluding a Tomcat default embedded server. If you want particular server, then we can add that particular dependency. So this is how we can exclude particular dependencies from the list of, or a bundle of starters from the starter Spring Boot starter. So this is how we can maintain. So this is quite simple, but we have to have a closer look in this, so you will understand much deeper. So this is all about the Spring Boot starters. So hope you all got about what are the Spring Boot starters and what are the built-in Spring Boot starters, and what is a Spring Boot starter parent, and with starter parent and without starter parent, how we can configure pom.xml, and how we can exclude a particular dependency from the starter dependency. So this is all about the Spring Boot starter. Hope you all understood what are the Spring Boot starters. If you still have any doubts, please comment in the comment box. I'll make sure to answer each one of your questions. If you really like this video, give me a like for this video, and please subscribe to MasterJSkills. Thanks again for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Until then, take care.